Welcome on behalf of the trustees of the Concord Free Public Library Corporation. We are gathered here tonight with special collection enthusiasts to celebrate Leslie Perrin Wilson's illustrious career as curator of the William Monroe Special Collections. You can see I'm already getting a little bit teary-eyed, but many of you were among the more than 250 people who came to the opening of Leslie's final exhibition, Curator's Choice, which was a strong testament to the impact that Leslie has had on the community. Through her leadership and vision, the special collections have become a world-class resource. Our plan this evening is that we have several speakers, as you know, and following the speakers, we have a lovely buffet dinner, so we want you to enjoy that. We also want to invite you to sign, if you haven't already, this lovely guest book for Leslie as a keepsake. And in addition to that, there are some cards on your table. If you would prefer, or in addition to, fill them out. We have a lovely matching box made out of these Florentine papers for Leslie to keep the tribute cards as well in the book. So I'm sure she'd appreciate that. Okay. It is now my pleasure to introduce the first speaker of the evening, distinguished historian and avid user of our special collections, Robert Gross.
I'm tempted, being in the library after hours, to ask if I could see those Kai's letters. Is there a light? How do I turn this? There we go. So I typed up my remarks because I was told I had to be short, but I tend to overwrite. Concord has long claimed a special place in the annals of America. It takes pride in having been Massachusetts' first frontier, the first English settlement beyond the sight and smell of the sea. It boasts of being the birthplace of the Revolution at the Old North Bridge. It was the seat of the American Renaissance in the mid-19th century, home of Emerson and Thoreau, Hawthorne and the Alcotts. With good reason, then, the town plays an oversized role in our history and our literature. The events that happened here were truly important for state and nation. Concord was, in the words of Henry James, that Leslie likes to quote, the biggest little place in America. But communities don't get attention just because they deserve it. They have to work for it. In the 19th century, the residents of this town were sometimes mocked, as was Thoreau by his Harvard classmates, for their Concord conceit. Lexington attempted to take credit for the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, and they rose as one in protest, overcoming all other differences between them. Local leaders worked strenuously to build up the town and maintain its importance. Emerson tried to recruit Thomas Carlyle to live here, and what he dreamed would be a literary village. That never happened. But as early as the 1840s, tourists were arriving here to see the site of the shot heard round the world, and the house where Hawthorne wrote Mosses from an Old Manse. Perhaps the largest share of the credit for sustaining the town's reputation belongs to the Concord Free Public Library and its special collections. Founded as a public-private partnership on William Monroe's expansive vision in 1873. From its beginnings as a collection of manuscripts, art, and other materials to document local life and the individuals famous and little known who have resided here, Special Collections has steadily gained in significance. Today, it is more prominent than ever, thanks to the remarkable work of Leslie Perrin Wilson over nearly a quarter century. Under her guiding hand, Special Collections has developed into a unique archive that, to my knowledge, has no counterpart in this country. It's a local institution serving school children and townspeople interested in the history, genealogy, and houses of the place where they live, at the same time as it maintains collections of immense significance for students of American history, literature, art, music, social reform, education, and a host of other subjects. Just check out recent books and articles on Emerson, Thoreau, and the Transcendentalists, and you'll see the evidence in the many acknowledgments to the CFPL and to Leslie Wilson. How did Leslie accomplish so much over these years, all the while living in Lancaster and then in Clinton? I've known her since she started working full-time in special collections in the spring of 1991, and have come to rely on her extraordinary knowledge and command of the collections. She welcomes everyone, whatever the topic they are pursuing, and shows a keen interest in their projects. Her intellectual curiosity is wide-ranging across the centuries of Concord history and the multiplicity of local activities. And she brings a wonderful enthusiasm to opening up the sources for one and all. And she gets excited whenever there's a chance to discover something new. Leslie has set the template for a special collections librarian, serving both local and scholarly communities. Not only did she come to command this rich collection of materials, she became a student in her own right of Concord people and society. I counted on her CV something close to 20 publications, a collection of essays in history's embrace, drawn from the columns she wrote for the Concord Journal, an update of Alan French's Historic Concord, a volume picturing Emerson, co-authored with Joel Meyerson and issued by Harvard University Press, at least 12.5 articles, some of which featured diaries and reminiscences in special collections, with her own incisive introductions highlighting their significance. These publications undoubtedly gave an outlet to Leslie's historical interest, but they also served to highlight the archives over which she presided and to disseminate them to wider audiences. She did the same with the online exhibits and finding aids on the Special Collections website. Preservation and access have always gone together. In like manner, she regularly welcomes students at local schools and college students and faculty elsewhere to see the collections. Year after year, she has dazzled visitors with presentations of such items as the manuscript to Thoreau's essay, Walking, alongside the Atlantic Monthly issue in which it appeared. No NEH Summer Institute for college faculty or high school teachers has ever been complete without a trip to special collections. And then there are the many exhibits and talks she featured to publicize the holdings, celebrate notable anniversaries, Thoreau's bicentennial, the biggest of all, and call attention to new acquisitions, such as the sketches of Ada Shepherd. These exhibits, which have in recent years gained attention from WGBH and other media outlets, provide still another way to serve the townspeople with the collections. And finally, as Leslie notes in her final exhibit, A Curator's Choice, still on view upstairs, she's expanded the holding substantially with carefully chosen acquisitions. As I viewed the exhibit last week, I was struck by several things. First, her determination to build on strength, adding materials that extended and enhanced existing manuscripts, require a sharp sense of the interconnection among people and events in the town. Second, her love for art, photography, and visual sources is exceptional for a special collections librarian, many of whom are only caught up in handwritten manuscripts in print. Third, she's been eager to widen the view of the local past and to introduce new actors from up and down the social order. Women in particular come to the fore in ways that have never previously been the case. And finally, she appreciates the role of voluntary associations in the town and their role in state and nation, such as the Concord Dance Hostess Committee during World War II. The band will come after our dinner and you'll be obliged to dance with us. veteran of any of America's wars. All this comes down to a central guiding vision. Leslie Wilson developed a rich sense of the continuous yet changing community that is Concord, advanced it in special collections, and built such a community among the many people who seek her out. And Curator's Choice, we can see that choice, was not just about manuscripts and photographs, but about the kind of community she wanted to sustain. As a result, the exhibit is an epitome of the special collections, and Leslie, the epitome of a special collections librarian. The bar is set incredibly high for her successor. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. It is now my pleasure to introduce a sustainer of Concord history and avid user of our special collections, Anna Winter Rasmussen.
As historian David McCullough so simply and repeatedly states, history is human. It is about people, and they speak to us across the years. McCullough contends that the confluence and importance of Concord history is unparalleled regarding the origin and the evolution of our nation. In downtown Concord, both the gravity and levity of our storied historic past is omnipresent. But beyond the souvenir coffee cups and t-shirts rendering our town's legacy in two dimension, there lies an oasis where we can experience a rare stillness capable of facilitating actual conversation with those very human, multidimensional individuals from our past, so willing and able to speak to us across the years. This oasis is Special Collections. To me, as a novice researcher, it has always felt like a secret garden, quietly transformative and complete with its master gardener and botanist in residence, Leslie Perrin Wilson. For the past 23 years, Leslie has lovingly nurtured, cultivated, and grown this garden. But the most profound gift Leslie has left for us is the challenge to truly open our eyes to the depths of the collection's multifaceted, interconnected wisdom. As Thoreau wrote, the question is not what you look at, but how you look and whether you see. For a layperson like myself, one's experience of Special Collections might have begun as follows. You approach the gate to the garden, ring the bell, and are greeted with a sweet, soft welcome by Connie Manoli Skoke. Leslie emerges from her work area. Her elegance and stature measure up to her larger-than-life curator of utmost excellence reputation. Now, you needn't look down, for it is clear she has substantial feet. The size that will leave shoes way too big to ever adequately fill. Now, with a distinctive professionalism, warmed with a smile familiar and kind, she asks, "What can I get for you today?" Like being in the presence of a most trusted and competent short-order cook, ready to serve up your favorite meal, you place your order and take a seat. But here is where Leslie weaves her magic. She quickly returns with your request, but more often than not, she circles back, and without you hardly noticing, swoops in and drops off one, or maybe two, or even three additional primary sources to perfectly augment your investigative journey, saying quietly as she returns to the many beckoning projects that encircle her desk, "I don't know if those items might be of any interest. You decide and have fun." And here lies the brilliance and the gift of Leslie. Embodying a knowledge of special collections so vast, so deep, and so thoroughly complete, she could easily suggest a straight and direct course for us novice researchers and provide us a well-worn roadmap. But instead, she welcomes us to experiment, to look around corners and under rocks, and lets us decide just how much we wish to see. You see, our experience of Leslie is not just as curator, but as teacher and mentor. And her gift is all the more evident working with young students. As I witnessed her reluctantly summoned by a student both embarrassed and frustrated by their failed attempts to decipher 18th century script for the first time, Leslie leans over the document and says, this is tough because in the 1700s, they would write an S in a way that looks like an F. So, might that first word be possessions? What do you think? The student nods in agreement and relief and then takes a whirl at reading the full paragraph, succeeds and asks, hey, are there more of these documents? Once again, she hands us the tools and lets us commit to the pleasure of digging. Now, after being fully immersed and steeped in Concord history for 23 years, you might think Leslie could find herself jaded by the vast quantity of popular images and icons that she has had to review and catalog ad nauseum. But I am here to attest that that is not the case. During a recent visit to Special Collections, I sat in quiet bliss, leafing through colonial records, illustrating the benevolence shown one another in the early Concord community, while reading of Peter Wright providing a pair of gloves for the widow Brown, or Samuel Hayward sewing a new woolen waistcoat for the elderly and poor Joshua Hutchinson. I began musing on how our modern acts of neighborly kindness might match up. Suddenly, I'm startled from my reverie by Leslie's unusual and quite audible query of her colleague Jessica. She exclaims, "Take a look at this." Now, I'm not going to be offended if you don't agree, but I have looked at 1,000,000 of these images of the Daniel Chester French statue, and as far as I'm concerned, this is by far the sexiest image of the Minuteman I have ever seen. Now, I don't care what you say. This guy is darn sexy. Just check out that reflection on the musculature of his calf. Well, so now, after over 2 decades, as Leslie might say, of looking at this dude with a gun, she revealed to everyone in Special Collections that day that despite her refined scholarly, intellectual, and serious nature, her passion still burns alive and well for a good-looking male figure. And as she would remind us, of course I'm passionate. I'm part Italian. And so Leslie leaves us with her final exhibition. Wearing hats of both curator and art director, she has carefully chosen and displayed a sampling of items she has personally stewarded the acquisition of. As with her affinity for sexy calf muscles, she makes no excuse for what she calls her highly subjective me. She celebrates it. And in so doing, she celebrates and encourages our highly selective selves. In our viewing of these items, that which is human, that which speaks to us, that which widens our perspective of being alive, provides us an opportunity to not just look, but to truly see. We are transported by the vision and art of Keyes, Shepard, Anderson, and Gleason. We look around and Barrett opens a new window into the Civil War. Louisa May sadly and suddenly becomes a parent. Young Hoare is impatient. French protests his statue's pedestal. A handbill makes Leslie shriek. Wheeler brings home Wyeth. A Pritchard sister advocates law-breaking. Edward Emerson leaves medicine for a paint palette. Eliza Monroe invites us to play chess. The dance host committee asks if we would join them on the dance floor. And Caleb Kendall Wheeler, a boy who loves the row, a young man who becomes a husband, a war that takes his life. A Western Union telegram, April 24th, 1945. Dear Mrs. Elizabeth T. Wheeler, your husband was killed in action. We look away, but then we step closer to read it again, because it speaks of the profound finality of death and loss, as tragedy belongs to all of us to own. But Leslie directs us to the right, and we are heartened by a display of the continuum of life, the extraordinary journeys of Caleb's younger brother, Joe, underscoring the power of human resilience and the will to carry on, to reach out, and to reach far, and to make a difference. And so, Leslie, you invited us to take a look, and we did see. As we descend down the gallery stairs, we know that we have been spoken to across time and circumstance, and we are the wiser for it. Thoreau wrote, "The only danger in friendship is that it will end." So Leslie, your stewardship of the lovely garden you have cultivated here in special collections will come to its end, and you will move on to plant new ground. But know that you will be sorely missed, and always remember that the bonds of friendship you have so graciously shared with so many of us will never weaken or ever be forgotten. Thank you, Leslie. Our collective and heartfelt congratulations on a truly remarkable career.
Thank you, Anna. And now, native son and donor of significant family papers to our special collections, Caleb's younger brother, Joseph Wheeler.
Well, this is a wonderful occasion. It happens to come 2 days before Mother's Day. And I would like to mention my mother. Alas, she died about 50 years ago. But she wrote a book, Concord, Climate for Freedom. And it's available at the Concord Museum. Now, in that book, on page, I think, 94 or something like that, there's a discussion of her visit to the Concord Assessor's Office. And she wanted to see the oldest assessment list in the files. Well, she discovered that the oldest assessment list was 1717, nearly 100 years after Concord was settled in 1635. Well, she was given the opportunity to make a copy of that, and did so. She found something very interesting in terms of Concord history. She said that in 1717, there were 293 taxpayers, Poles. And she said that the value of all the land in Concord and the buildings on it was something like 2,264 pounds. Now, I leave it to you to translate that into modern day dollars, but I think you will guess that the value of land and buildings in those days was slightly less than it is today. And she discovered that personal property was actually in greater quantity in terms of value than the real estate. It ran around $2,600, pounds. And it consisted of big animals. The larger animals that farmers might have. And she in 1916, when she married my father, they moved to the farm on which Henry David Thoreau was born, and called it Thoreau Farm. And they had a dairy farm, and they had something like 16 to 20 cows, and a certain number of calves, and a couple of horses, so that their assessed value was, I must say, considerably more than the assessed value of my father's predecessor back in 1717. In those days, a farm had, if they were lucky, if they were a little bit better off than average, they would have a horse. And they would have 2 oxen, sometimes only 1 oxen, but usually 2 oxen. And they would have 2 or 3 cows. And these cows did not produce very much milk. Then they would have 5 or so sheep. And they didn't assess the value of pigs or chickens, but we know that farms had those. And I think that it's useful to remember that the business of farming in Concord went from this kind of a level. This is already after nearly 100 years of Concord's life, since its 1635 incorporation. But these farmers were producing produce for their own family, and they might have some extra, because they would make with any extra milk, they would be making cottage cheese or butter, and who knows what else they might have made with it, or they could make it available to a neighbor whose cow was not at that time milking. And I think that it's interesting to think of what life was like in those early days. Anyway, she had the challenge back in around 2028, 1928. Her father of Watertown wanted to do a history of Watertown, because Watertown was having its 300th anniversary in 1930. And so for the Watertown Historical Association, they wrote a book called Great Little Watertown. And then she was asked to be vice chairman of the committee that put on our 300th anniversary in 1935, 5 years later than Watertown in Boston, incidentally. As she sort of supervised or watched over the Concord players who were putting on the Drama of Concord by Alan French, who is a very important historian in the history of Concord. Thinking about it, she wondered whether it wouldn't be fun or important to the town, perhaps, to do little histories of each of the houses in Concord at that time more than 100 years of age. And she embarked on this, and then she thought, well, if I'm going to write them, why don't I get them put in the local newspaper? And so these articles were printed in the Concord Enterprise, which a paper which disappeared after some years, and then with the Concord Journal. And I found myself interested in this and went to special collections, and there was Leslie, and she told me about this new system of putting all these newspapers on some kind of cellophane and putting it on a machine, and you push buttons and you can read the newspapers. And I enjoyed doing that, and I did it for week after week, day after day, hours down in special collections, able to sort of watch the operation of the place. And I made an index of all the articles that my mother wrote. Turned out there were some 200 of these articles of historic nature, half or so of them being on specific houses, and the other half on more general subjects. Well, in recent years I've wondered whether anybody knew about these articles. I mean, of course, if you lived in the period 1935 to 1973, you might have been clipping them out and making a collection. But if you were a later resident of the town or later got interested in our history, you just simply wouldn't know about them. So, having made an index of these articles, I also decided to write a memoir on my mother. And Leslie got so excited by this project because she had realized that Concord, her history was an important moment in historic writing about Concord, that she said, well, look, why don't you write it, and I will review it, and I'll read what you've written. And she didn't say, but she meant, and I will fix your writing. and a couple of times she caught me in inaccuracy, and that interested me. As I was writing this memoir, I realized that my mother was not just a farmer, a farmer's wife. She was not just a head of local women's organizations. She was a very active person in town meeting, and sometimes she could be rough. She would take on a superintendent of schools, and to the point where she made a motion because he was making decisions about things that principals should make decisions about, and then when they didn't work out, he blamed them on the principal. So she said, we don't need a principal. We already have a dual citizen as superintendent and making decisions that ought to be made by the principal. So let's reduce the budget by the cost of one principal. And I wasn't sure whether that was going to be diplomatic. And so I said to Leslie, what's your advice about something like this? And she just looked at me immediately and said, just tell the truth. And I think that epitomized Leslie and her management of special collections. It was wonderful to work with her during the years that I worked on that memoir, which the library ended up publishing and making available to people who were interested. And then more recently, I had another idea. If we have these 200 articles and nobody knows about them, very few people would actually go through and read the list of those 200 articles to see which ones they might be interested in. Maybe we should put the index on the web. There's this new thing. They're beyond me, but I understand that they're very useful. And so the idea is to put these on the 200 articles index on the web, and then maybe over time to print some of them, particular ones that seem of rather general interest. And Leslie's been fighting for this opportunity and has succeeded. So I look forward sometime in the next few months to inviting you to look up the website and see the 200 articles that have since their publication in weekly newspapers been sort of lost to anybody interested in them. I must say that it has been a very special pleasure for me to work with Leslie. I was going to say that in my mother's book, on page 84 or something like that, she discusses going to the Concord assessor's office and asking for a copy of an early assessment, and she found it in the 1717 assessment. And then she went back before publication of her book and discovered that the one that she had copied had been lost. And I think that the lesson there is that the town was not always managing historic records of the town as efficiently as they might. And so when you think about special collections today, there's this mysterious room at the back which has a big lock on it, and I understand that it's set up with just the right moisture content, just the right temperature to preserve papers for the town of Concord. And I think it's important to realize how important the special collections is to the town, to the people of the town, and to the historians and the like around the world who are interested in this very special community. I think that because most of us deal with things above the ground level, so to speak, we forget that special collections is a wonderful archive for the town of Concord. It may be it would be in competition to be one of the best collections for a small town in the United States. And it's under significant demand because so many people are interested in this Concord, the first settlement in Massachusetts above tidewater, Watertown being the first community, but still below tidewater, and this town, a remarkable history of people coming together and talking about issues. I think I read in my mother's book that there was some 80 or 90 town meetings in the several years before the shot was heard around the world. And of course, this was happening in town meetings all over New England. So that when the time came that they had decided to take on the king and his representatives in Boston, they were collecting supplies for a military operation. And of course, we had Tories in Concord who told the Tories in Boston exactly what was going on here, even as there were, what would we call them, patriots in Boston who were keeping us well informed of what was happening to the British representatives there. And so they developed this whole system of Minutemen, and with Longfellow's poem about Paul Revere, which may not be completely accurate, but still the spirit is there. And I think that it's a wonderful thing, that a wonderful service that Special Collections does for the people of Concord, who are very proud of their town, and for the historians from around the world who come here in order to learn about Concord and why Concord was so special. And I just am so pleased to have had the chance to work with Leslie in this period of my retirement from my career, and wish her all the best as she moves on to, I'm sure, great successes in other endeavors. Thank you, Leslie.
And it is now my very great pleasure to introduce Leslie Perrin Wilson, Curator of the William Monroe Special Collections.
Thank you, Sherry, and Bob, and Joe, and Anna. I'm touched by your kind remarks, and I'm not sure I altogether recognize myself in them, but and I'm also very honored by this lovely celebration. A week ago, we formally opened Curator's Choice, my final exhibition here at the Concord Free Public Library, which will be on view in the gallery until late July. This show highlights 100 items I've added to the special collections over the years and explores why they resonate for me personally. Assembling this show has provided me with an opportunity to think about how the special collections have evolved into a world-class archive of Concord documentation. Last week, I focused my comments on collection development, the subject of the exhibition. Tonight, I'd like to talk a bit about that and also about several other aspects of special collections management I've focused on during my time here, activities that will continue to demand attention and resources in the coming years. Collection development, access, programming, and conservation are all among the major priorities of any special collections operation, and of course, they're all interrelated. I'll begin with collection development since I've been thinking a lot about that in connection with the exhibition. I've been fortunate to have had a good deal of encouragement and support in adding to an archive of more than local significance, for which there is considerable research demand and appreciation. It's fair to say that most public libraries would not be able to provide for the kind of collections we have here. As Joel Meyerson pointed out last week, even many college libraries don't offer collections as deep and extensive as those here. That this library can support the growth and well-being of important documentary holdings is due largely to the provisions of its founding. I'm referring, of course, to the joint public-private form of management under which the library has operated since it opened in 1873. The library buildings and property, artwork and manuscripts, archival materials, photographs, maps, and printed items in special collections are owned and supported by the private, nonprofit trustees of the Concord Free Public Library Corporation. The corporation pays for all special collections expenses except for personnel. That includes the purchase of materials for addition to the permanent collections, funding to undertake special access projects, sponsorship of exhibitions and programs, budgeting for archival supplies, conservation and related services, and security as well. The trustees also set policy relating to the special collections and their use. The town pays for staffing the department. The special collections staff is the smallest among the library departments. It includes a full-time curator, a part-time assistant. In earlier times, that was the wonderful Joyce Woodman, who was succeeded by the equally wonderful Connie Manoli-Skokie, and until 2.5 years ago, a part-time technical assistant, Bob Hall. The lion's share of archival and manuscript acquisitions have always come through gift. You can see that for yourself up in the gallery. And I'm grateful to the generous descendants of Concord families who've entrusted us with their papers. In addition, the corporation actively devotes a line in its annual budget for special collections for acquisitions to the department. Moreover, the curator can always present a case for purchases of significant beyond-budget materials as they become available. I've tried not to overuse that privilege and only to request special funding for really worthwhile potential purchases. Each time I've asked, the corporation has granted my request. This arrangement has allowed me to make some spectacular purchases. The photographic negatives of Herbert Wendell Gleason in 1997, for example, and more recently, a hefty quantity of the working manuscript of Louisa May Alcott, both of which are up in the gallery on display. The fact that I'm able to add to the collections actively by purchase as well as more passively by gift is big. It means that I'm able to shape and enhance holdings in deliberate ways, to use a Thoreauvian word. But of course, once you acquire a collection, you need to think about access, about making it available. Some of you may be familiar with the extensive special collections pages on the library's website. If you look under the heading Finding Aids there, you'll discover about 250 finding aids for archival and manuscript collections. Also on the library website, you'll find a variety of web pages devoted to providing digital access to selected holdings and a great deal of interpretive information. Some of these pages, notably the Thorough Survey pages, were created through the award of grant funding to the department. And if you consult the Minuteman Library Network online catalog, you'll find thousands of bibliographic records for all kinds of material in special collections. These tools collectively represent how researchers find out what we have. A finding aid, for those of you unfamiliar with the term, is the primary descriptive tool for archival and manuscript collections. It's a product of the processing, the organization, and arrangement of a collection. It's labor-intensive to process collections and to create finding aids to a level of description precise enough to tell a researcher whether a collection is relevant to his or her topic and which specific boxes and folders will be needed. Creating original bibliographic records is also time-consuming. You can't get ready-made cataloging of the kind that exists for newly published books for the unique and unusual items in special collections. It takes expertise and personnel hours to create them, as it does to create substantive web pages. I first came to the library on grant funding in 1980 as part of a project to create machine-readable cataloging for the printed volumes relating to the 19th century Concord authors. Because the library had never had staffing to prepare the kind of cataloging records these materials required, Barbara Powell, who was then head of reference and later library director, wrote a grant proposal to the National Endowment for the Humanities for funding a cataloger to do that work. Later, in the 1990s, I came back on a temporary part-time basis, then stayed on to write grant proposals for special collections, processing and cataloging projects, and to direct funded projects. I became curator on Marcia Moss's retirement in 1996. By the late 1990s, significant progress had been made on the cataloging of printed special collections holdings. Additionally, about 65% of our archival and manuscript material had been processed and described through grant funding. There was a dramatic increase, in fact, a 100% increase in the use of these materials once detailed information about them became publicly available. So accomplishing the work increased the demands on staff imposed by research visits and inquiries. Moreover, we continue to acquire new holdings, and our staff remains small, so it was hard to further reduce the processing backlog. Fortunately, 5 years ago, the Library Corporation designated the first in a series of gifts of funding to the town for specific processing projects. In 2014, I was able to hire archivist Janaea Kizzy to process the First Parish in Concord records, a very big collection at 65 plus linear feet. Janaea later took on 2 additional rounds of projects in special collections. One very popular project Janaea worked on was the organization, arrangement, and description of the Concord postcard collection, which included a visual as well as a descriptive component. In her finding aid, the description of every one of the nearly 900 postcards in the collection is accompanied by a thumbnail image, and there are a selected number for which there are high-resolution images available for public use. So some evening when you don't have a whole lot else to do, make yourself a bowl of popcorn and sit in front of your computer and scroll through the Concord postcards. Once material is accessible, it's natural to think about ways to bring it to public attention, that is, about programming. I know that many of you regularly attend our exhibition openings and lecture series and our standalone programs. For example, the joint lecture by Joel Meyerson and Daniel Shealy last October in recognition of the sesquicentennial of Little Women. Some of the subjects of exhibitions mounted in recent years include the Monroes of Lexington and Concord, a collaboration with the Lexington Historical Society. Concord and Abraham Lincoln for the Civil War anniversary. The story of N.C. Wyeth's paintings for the 1936 book Men of Concord, part of a highly publicized and successful collaboration with the Concord Museum. Emerson Iconography to celebrate a book on the subject I co-authored with Joel Meyerson. Thoreau's relationship with Concord for the bicentennial anniversary of the author's birth. And the recently donated sketchbooks and letters of Ada Shepard, the young woman who served as governess to the Hawthorne children while the family traveled abroad in the late 1850s following Hawthorne's tenure as American consul in Liverpool. All of the expenses related to mounting such exhibitions are paid for through funding in the curator's annual budget from the corporation. And when we do a special opening or a lecture series to accompany a show, the Library Corporation covers any costs associated with bringing distinguished lecturers in from out of town and also the event expenses. Our speakers have included Pulitzer Prize winners Megan Marshall and John Madison, Concord's own Bob Gross, thorough biographer Laura Dassau-Walls, and many equally impressive others. This space, the Rotunda, is perfect for lively and interesting programs exploring Concord subjects. I have so enjoyed mounting exhibitions for an appreciative audience. I confess that it's always been my favorite part of the job. Moreover, I think it's hard to overstate the importance of this kind of outreach. It brings the holdings of special collections to life for an intelligent, informed general audience, and in the process raises awareness of the cultural and historical value of the collections. And a well-informed fan club is one of the best forms of protection for rare or unique materials. Sometimes the corporation has also funded printed catalogs to accompany our exhibitions. And I believe there are copies over in the front hallway that you can all take of the catalog for curator's choice with you tonight. This level of outreach is pretty ambitious for a small operation. It's really only possible with corporation support. But people enjoy it and benefit from it, and I've been assured that it will remain a focus of departmental efforts going forward. And finally, a word about conservation. All use of materials, whether by patrons for research or by staff for exhibition and programming, results in some degree of wear and tear to collections. Conservation of fragile or damaged special collections material is periodically necessary to ensure their accessibility in the future. Access and preservation go hand in hand. As you likely know, conservation is a specialty. Conservators need to be well trained, and curators need to be able to rely on professionals who can tackle delicate procedures on rare and valuable holdings. We're lucky to have on staff Louisa Granito, a part-time conservator trained at the North Bennett Street School in Boston. Louisa is responsible for conservation work on all the library's holdings, special collections included. Unfortunately, that means that she's very busy. I can only claim a limited amount of her time. For complex and extremely time-consuming projects, we rely on outside conservators, both private conservators and also the Northeast Document Conservation Center, known as NEDCC, in Andover. NEDCC is a cutting-edge, nonprofit regional facility that does work for many of the major archival and special collections repositories in New England and elsewhere. It's wonderful to have NEDCC close by, but even though it's nonprofit, the work done there is labor-intensive and the staff highly skilled, which means that what they do is expensive. I've gotten grant funding for conservation work there, and the corporation has approved funding for specific requests. For example, the cleaning and conservation at NEDCC of a volume of Wordsworth presented to Nathaniel Hawthorne by Sophia Peabody in 1839, just after they got engaged, and given to the library by a Hawthorne descendant in 2006. You'll find that book up in the exhibition. Happily, over the past few years, a frequent user of special collections and her husband have made a series of generous gifts to the Library Corporation for the conservation of specific items. Through these gifts, we've been able to undertake extensive repair of the first, much-used, very battered volume of Concord Lyceum records from the 1820s to 1859, and Edward Jarvis's extensively extra-illustrated copy of Shattuck's 1835 History of Concord. This combination of donor interest and corporation support has made a real difference in the ability to care for the collections. All of this is enough, I think, to reinforce what you already know, that the responsible stewardship of documentary heritage requires a lot of resource and collective effort. The model of public-private management devised by library founder William Monroe created a mechanism for protecting and supporting valuable holdings, which has allowed these amazing special collections here to flourish. This evening celebrates a personal milestone for me, and I thank you all for sharing it. But the work I've been privileged to undertake has only been possible through William Monroe's foresight, which we can also celebrate tonight. Thank you.
Leslie. So we have just John Boynton, one of the trustees of the corporation, and myself are just going to share some exciting news with you, some of which you probably already know. So this fall, we are planning to break ground on an exciting building project that will allow us to meet growing community needs, including the enhancement of our special collections by providing significantly more space for our wonderful exhibition programs, display of our collections, and improved workspace for both staff and users of the collections.
The corporation is actively raising funds for that expansion. We're on track to complete the leadership phase of that process this spring, and this fall we'll dive into the community phase of the fundraising. It's interesting to note that nearly 70% of Concordians have library cards, and we hope to have at least that percentage of town participate in the campaign. We're particularly thrilled to announce that last night we received an extraordinarily generous pledge to the campaign. This donor, who wishes to remain anonymous, pledged $250,000 to the campaign in honor of Leslie's service as curator. I can't tell you how exciting it was to get that message. The trustees plan to mount a beautiful plaque in the Special Collections area to commemorate Leslie's 23 years of service to this library. So we're very excited to recognize her and her many contributions in that way. That gift, incidentally, brings the campaign total to $7,989,962, or just $10,000 shy of the $8 million mark. So we're making progress. Many of you have supported this campaign already, and I want to say thank you.
In the public-private partnership created by the library's founder, the Library Corporation is the steward of the William Monroe Special Collections, responsible for its preservation and growth. But this is only possible with the support of our generous donors. Tonight, we'd like to announce that we'll be creating a fund in Leslie's honor to sustain this outstanding resource through acquisitions, exhibitions, programs, conservation, education, and anything else that may be necessary to sustain the vision and vibrancy that Leslie has brought to the special collections over the past 23 years to create this world-class research collection. We invite you to join us in this effort. There are cards on your tables, and we are so appreciative of your generous support of the library in so many ways. And that concludes the program this evening, and we're delighted that you're all here, and we hope that you'll stay and continue to enjoy the party. Thank you.